So the last issue we're going to address in this lecture is Marx's theory of history. How does he account for the big historical changes we've seen occur over time? And the general answer is that Marx sees social change occurring as a result of changes in the economic, and particularly the class structure. So it's kind of class dynamics that are the motors of history. They are what is producing major social changes. So we're going to see that the way to characterize Marx's theory of history is dialectical materialism. The materialism part of this comes from the fact that, again, the driver, the motor of this history are things that are occurring in the realm of economic and class position. But Marx also argues that change comes about through a dialectical process. And the idea of a dialectic and dialectical processes traces to Hegel and his theories, his idealistic theory. And what we're going to see is that Marx takes kind of the framework of Hegel's ideas and his idealistic conception of how history works, and then grounds it in materialist structures. So the very famous phrase of this is that Marx stands Hegel on his feet, in the sense of Hegel's everything for Hegel is happening in the brain, and then Marx is trying to kind of ground his thought in actual materialist economic processes and structures. So A&E give us a general sense of what Hegel means by a dialectic, but it's important to kind of walk through it because we're going to see Marx borrows this framework, and we'll see it as basically replaces ideas with classes. So Hegel puts forward this idea of a dialectic, and the end result for Hegel is basically perfect thinking, right? He calls this the absolute idea, and it basically be a situation where all of a sudden humanity comes to like perfect clairvoyance. They understand exactly what's going on. They have total knowledge and understanding of everything that is occurring in the universe. So that's the end point of Hegel's thinking. And he wants to say the process through which we get there, ultimately we'll get there, is this dialectical one. And the way this works is there's a thesis put forward, an idea or a claim. Each thesis produces an antithesis, or its antithesis. And these two are an antagonistic relationship to one another. They're usually opposites of one another. Both probably have some elements of truth. Both probably also contain errors. And by synthesizing them, we can get the truth out of them, eliminate the errors, and we can do this by creating, and we do this through a process of synthesis. So we bring the good parts together, we eliminate the bad. Once we have the synthesis, this becomes a new thesis. This new thesis produces its own antithesis. These are antagonistic relationships to one another. Another round of synthesis occurs, and this goes on and goes on and goes on until at some point we've accumulated all the knowledge of the world, and then we've eliminated all the errors, and then we're left with this kind of like perfect godlike knowledge. And A&E give the example of one thesis that can be put forward is that women are inferior to men. This could produce an antithesis then of actually, no, it's the opposite, is that men or women are superior to men. So these ideas are in contradiction to one another, they're opposites. And if we look at them, we can say, okay, well, they both have errors, right? Because not all men are superior to women, and not all women are superior to men. But each has its faults too, or some elements of truth too, right? There are some men who are superior to some women, and then there is also some women that are superior to some men. And so if we synthesize these two, we bring them together, we come up with this idea that, oh, men and women are equal, right? They have the same distribution of capabilities as the other group. And then once we have this idea, this will become a new synthesis, or sorry, new thesis, and then this kind of whole thought process could kind of continue to move forward. We don't need to worry so much about Hegel's way of thinking in these terms and how Hegel saw kind of thought moving in this progressive manner, the particulars of it. But what's important for us is this framework of thesis leading to antithesis, leading to synthesis, leading to new thesis, and then this process keeps going on with some endpoint being possible. So for us, we're just going to focus on this framework. So Marx read a lot of Hegel. He was very familiar with his ideas. At one point in his life, he was a member of a young Hegelians club. And so he borrowed a lot of Hegel's ideas and incorporated it into his thought. But Hegel was an idealist, right? All of this thesis, antithesis, synthesis is going inside of people's heads. Again, independent of their economic conditions. You're just walking on the street and a light bulb goes off and you have a thesis and that sparks antithesis and so on and so forth. Marx wants to ground these kind of processes in more materialistic ones. And so the way he does it is basically by replacing ideas with social classes. And so this is kind of a sketch of Marx's theory of dialectical materialism. The thing to note is that, well, the Hegel one, kind of like progress is going upward here. Here, kind of the historical evolutionary process is going down. And this picture is a little bit oversimplified because, as you might have picked up from the Communist Manifesto, Marx wants to say historically there are tons of different class positions. But one of the aspects of capitalism is that it's boiling them down into two main class groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But the same framework that Hegel is using, Marx is adopting, but he's just replacing ideas with class interests. So at one time there were nobles. This class then produced slaves. These two groups were antagonistic to one another. There was conflict. This produces lords. Lords produces serfs. These groups are in an antagonistic relationship to one another. As a result of their kind of class conflict, we get the development of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie produced the opposite class, the proletariat. And then we'll talk about where history goes from here. So we're seeing class dynamics going on. And so in the ancient world, in feudalism, Marx thinks there's a lot of different classes that are in antagonistic relationship to one another. But when we get to capitalism and industrial society, the main thing that occurs is that we get just the bourgeoisie and just the proletariats as the two main classes. As distinct classes, they each have their own set of interests, and their interests are in conflict with one another, right? Because if the proletariat wants to earn more money, that's going to kind of consequentially mean that the bourgeois is going to earn less money, and vice versa. If the bourgeoisie wants more profit, Marx is going to argue that's going to have to come at the expense of the proletariat. For Marx, the fact that in industrial society, classes are boiled down to these two groups is important because it allows for, he would phrase it, for history to eventually end. And we'll talk about what that means here in a minute. But Marx argues we have the bourgeoisie, we have the proletariat. Through a process we'll talk about here in a minute, what's going to happen is that the number of bourgeoisie over time is going to shrink, even though the amount of wealth that they are going to possess is going to increase. And at the same time, the ranks of the proletariat are going to swell. And at some point, the number of proletariats is going to be so large and the number of bourgeoisie is going to be so small that a revolution is going to take place, and the bourgeoisie are going to go away. And what makes this process different from, again, these kind of class dynamics that have occurred in the past is now we're only dealing with two classes. If the bourgeoisie go away, that means there's only one class. And if there's only one class, that means everyone shares the same relationship to the means of production. And it also means everyone shares the same interests. And so if everyone's basically on the same page, because everyone's in the same objective position, there is no more antagonism. There are no more class dynamics. We just have one class. And if that is the case, then we have socialism, and socialism is going to pave the way for communism. But the idea here is that, again, there's a lot that's going on prior to here. Under capitalism, there's only two classes. Eventually, the bourgeoisie go away, where we're left with one class. Everyone's got the same interests. That means everyone's on the same page, and we have social harmony. The end point of history, from Marx's point of view, has been achieved. Now, that doesn't mean that time stops or anything like that. It just means that that class conflict, which has driven history forward, ends, and now Marx thinks people can live in harmony, and precisely because everyone's a member of the same class. So this is a very utopian conception of history, the fact that Marx thinks that history can end with everyone being on the same page. It's also utopian in the sense that Marx thinks that in this kind of end state of history, where everyone's a member of the working class and we all share the same interests, that we are going to be in a position where we can basically live our lives completely in terms of how we want to. So Marx talks about how, like, you could be a fisherman in the morning, a painter in the afternoon, a woodworker midday, and a scholar by night, because we just have complete freedom to do whatever we want, and that the material conditions of society would allow for that, which, again, is utopian in a sense of like, oh, wouldn't that be wonderful and grand? But it also may not be very realistic, because there are some key problems and issues with a lot that Marx did not consider in terms of how are goods going to be distributed to different groups and things like that. Nevertheless, this is Marx's theory of history. Class dynamics go on. They boil down into the two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie go away. History ends because everyone's part of the same class. Everyone shares the same interests, and life is wonderful and grand. So why does Marx think that when we just have the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, that the ranks of the proletariat are going to increase and those of the bourgeoisie are going to decrease? And how is that going to allow for this kind of revolution to take place in which history ends? Well, if we look at how Marx thinks capitalist societies are structured, we've got the bourgeoisie, we have the proletariats, and then a class, that position that hasn't come up yet, but we can talk about, it's the lumpen proletariat, who are basically the unemployed. Okay. And life for the proletariat is not great, but life for the lumpen proletariat is even worse, because these people have a little money, these people have no money. So Marx definitely thinks that there is inter-class competition. So the bourgeoisie have interests that are different from the proletariat and vice versa. And there's a struggle to see whose interests are going to prevail. So there's struggles over the length of the working day. The bourgeoisie are saying, hey, let's have the working day be 16 hours. And the proletariats are saying, no, let's have it be 10. So there's competition here. But there's also intra-class competition, both for the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So competition within this group. So for the proletariats, right, there are some workers who are more productive than others. And if you're not a productive worker and say there's an economic recession or a business needs to cut back, you could then lose your job. And if you lose your job, then you fall down to the lumpen proletariat. So workers are competing between each other to hold and secure jobs. At the same time, there's interclass competition between the bourgeoisie. So you have two producers of the same widget. Each of them is trying to control the market. If one of those people wins, right, one business controls the market, the other business could go out. The other business could go out of business. And if that's the case, someone who was maybe part of the bourgeoisie, they lose their business, and now they're a member of the proletariat. If they go to work for someone else, or maybe they fall to the lumpen proletariat because they can't find any sort of work. So Marx thinks that the interclass competition that occurs between the bourgeoisie is going to result in a situation where those who are successful in this competition are going to get bigger. And then once they get bigger, then they're more likely to drive out other competitors, and they're going to get even bigger. And it's going to keep going on. So the membership in the bourgeoisie is going to shrink over time as we get a few basically like super bourgeoisie people who own and control virtually everything. So a very relatively small number of people controlling and dominating the means of production. But as the bourgeoisie fall out of this class, they're going to fall into the members of the proletariat, or maybe the lumpen proletariat. So these class positions are going to swell. And then Marx thinks at some point there's going to be so many members of the proletariat and so few members of the bourgeoisie, the proletariats are going to revolt. They're going to take over or strip the bourgeoisie from their means of production. The proletariats will then take over. And when they take over, all that's going to be left are the proletariats who are controlling the means of production, but there's no more conflict since everyone's part of the same class. They have the same relationship to the means of production, and this is where history ends and this kind of utopian life begins. I think it's pretty fair to say that Marx's conception of this kind of class conflict and what life would look like in a proletariat dominated society is really off the mark. There's really significant issues there. It's very utopian and very unrealistic. Nevertheless, as we'll talk about, Marx kind of gets the future wrong. But in terms of diagnosing some key aspects and dynamics of capitalism, we'll see Marx is pretty good. He gives us some good insights into some key dynamics of capitalism and how that economic system works. And we will talk about those more in class. So we'll see you then.